And so, welcome to Saltworks. For the last few weeks, we've been talking about generational dysfunction in the story of this family. That's really the central cast of characters in the scriptures, the story of Abraham and the generations to follow. And today we've wrestled at a new entrant into the conflict, which is interesting. We already know about Esau and Jacob's conflict, but now we have a new entrant that we're going to find in Genesis 32. So after Japhet prays for us, I'm going to read a couple verses and we'll find out about this new participant in the conflict and what that might mean. Japhet?
Brilliant. Absolutely. Heavenly Father, thank you again for this morning, this afternoon for some, and evening as well. Thank you for the Sabbath. Thank you for all that is in our life right now. And we ask for your blessing as we open your word. In Jesus' beautiful name, amen.
Amen. All right. You will signal to me when I'm not frozen anymore, won't you?
You're not.
Oh, yeah, you're not.
Oh, okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. So Jacob is on the run. This is a theme of his life, by the way. He's been on the run from his brother Esau, on the run now from his uncle Laban, and really never stopped being on the run from his brother. So he's on the run. There seems to be conflict in his life that's life-threatening. And here we go, verse 22 of Genesis 32. That night Jacob got up and took his 2 wives, his 2 female servants, and his 11 sons and crossed the ford of the Jabbok. After he had sent them across the stream, he sent over all his possessions, so Jacob was left alone, and a man wrestled with him until daybreak. When the man saw that he could not overpower him, he touched the socket of Jacob's hip, so that his hip was wrenched as he wrestled with the man. Then the man said, "Let me go, for it is daybreak." But Jacob replied, "I will not let you go unless you bless me." The man asked him, "What is your name?" "Jacob," he answered. Then the man said, "Your name will no longer be Jacob, but Israel, because you have struggled with God and with humans and have overcome." Jacob said, "Please tell me your name." But he replied, "Why do you ask my name?" Then he blessed him there. So Jacob called the place Peniel, saying, "It is because I saw God face to face, and yet my life was spared." The sun rose above him as he passed Peniel, and he was limping because of his hip. Therefore, to this day, the Israelites do not eat the tendon attached to the socket of the hip, because the socket of Jacob's hip was touched near the tendon. And I assume that means the tendon of an animal, not of a human, lest Japhet and Tim go, "Oh, there's cannibalism apparently here at the end of that. This is very interesting."
Hey, I want to posit something here for this story. It feels like, I don't know, growing up, you hear this story, right? And it's kind of a big deal. But this is like, what, 5 or 6 verses long. It's really short. Like, it's just like, oh, and by the way, there's a man in his tent, and he wrestles him all night. It's like they bury the lead. Like, the writer just buries the lead. I mean, to me, it seems, I don't know. I always grew up with the idea that this story was much larger. In the grand narrative, it's pretty short. And it's really kind of matter of fact, which, I mean, we need to argue that it's a Christophany, right? It's a theophany, right? It's a manifestation of God showing up. And oftentimes in the Old Testament, when we say, and it doesn't say it here, but when it says like the angel of the Lord, that's really an apositional statement, right? So it's really the angel that is the Lord. So what we have here is a theophany, right? A physical manifestation of God showing up in the tent. And it almost feels like it's, well, he just wrestled the guy at night. What would happen if you walked into your bedroom and there was a dude and he just went after you? You start wrestling. I mean, it seems like you'd write it up a little bit differently than that. I think. I think it's underplayed in the biblical text.
I think you're right as well, Tim, especially because it's not Jacob wrestling with the man, it's the man wrestling with Jacob. It's really the instigator has grabbed hold of him because of where Jacob is in his life, in his moment, what he is thinking, what he's what he's going through himself. But I do think that it's actually just written as if it's a matter of fact. This happens every single day, and it's really quick and easy. And then I saw the face of God. Have a good day. But you're right. It's been used a lot.
I think there may be something. A couple things, Tim, to what you said. One is I think there may be something to, at least in the global West, at least in America, we think of the big point needing to be big and long and boisterous and extravagant, and if 1,000 books get written about it, and I think in a biblical way of thinking, God often doesn't function that way. I forget if it's Lewis or someone else who talks about the shyness of God, right? That we think in terms of big and brash and loud, and here you have this thing. It is buried, but you have all the noise of this family story, and then, as you say, in just a handful of verses, you have this. And I think that doesn't set well with the way we think of things, because we think of crescendo, but I'm not sure that God shows up in a crescendo. In fact, there's many times where it's the whisper. It's even Jesus is a bit of a whisper. I mean, 3.5 years, often trying to deflect, and then I was talking to a colleague recently about 1,000 years of Christian history, and we scratch our heads like, what on earth happened like in the Middle Ages, and why was, where did that go? So I think that's interesting. That's one thing that's interesting to me, Tim, is how we think of the theophany. We think of it as symbols, and sometimes it's much quieter. It's a triangle. And then the other thing that's interesting to me, and this goes back to Abraham as well, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us. The story of Jesus may not have been the first time, so I'm curious about that. If this is God, and the Word and the Word became flesh and dwelt among Jacob and his family here. Is that so? Jesus is not the first time that God has been enfleshed. Maybe.
I wouldn't say maybe. I would say very clearly, and it seems to me. And feel free to push back on me on this. I've been preaching a theophany series. We're calling it Christophany, actually, and the argument in some respects is that every time God shows up in the flesh, that is Jesus, right? Old Testament,
Yes.
New Testament. The
Yes.
angel that is the Lord, right? It is, and it's not an angel with wings. Never do we have, that metaphor happening. I think what's interesting in this story, just to go back a little bit, what's interesting in this story is that Jacob was preparing for a crisis, and the crisis was with Esau. But he didn't end up having a crisis with Esau in the way that he had a crisis with God, right? And we see this again and again with the theophanies. There's a something coming that's going to be very difficult, and what God sort of does is he shows up and he thwarts every the direction that we think the crisis is coming. The confrontation ends up being with God, not with that other person or with that other nation or with that other. I think of Joshua. Right? They're about to take over Jericho. They're about to do it. And God goes, well, you really need to circumcise all the men first, because this is a spiritual battle. And in fact, I'm not even going to, it's not even really going to be a battle. You're going to walk around the city and sing, essentially. Gideon's the same way, right? I'm going to prepare you spiritually, because this is really, everything about this is really spiritual. And so the spiritual usurps kind of what's about to happen. And that's, I think, what happens when a theophany happens in our lives, right? We realize that the spiritual is more important than the physical, and it really is more real in some respects.
And it's not because... No, I think that's really good, Tim, because I think it's not something we often call upon first. And in this case here, God is the one who is, instigating, pushing himself into this place, saying, let me help you address this with your connection with me, when all he's thinking about is, where do I line my family up? What's the order of my family? What do I do with my wealth? How do I strategize to be able to move all the pieces into place? How am I going to deal with my brother? And God's like, we actually have something else to talk about. We have to talk about who you are. And you don't want to talk about who you are. You're worried about all these other things in your life. And I think that's the interjection of God in your life, is that God always brings you to a place that you are unexpected, that you are not dreaming or imagining, because you're so stressed about this. And God says, that's actually not what you should be worried about. this is what you should be worried about, and I'm going to interject in your life at this moment. And I think that happens in our relationships with people, that we don't always have the time to deal with this thing here because we think that this is the other issue, and there is always something deeper underneath that needs to be unpacked first. And God's doing this in real time with this guy.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, that's really good, Japhet. What do you make of? So this is wrestling. This isn't a conversation. I mean, why this? Why not? Why a fight? And why a fight that goes on throughout the night versus we had a chat, we had a dialogue, we had a debate. There's physicality here. This is not the three of us having a debate about some issue, over tea, Japhet. This is physical. Why? I mean, what is that? What is that?
I like that a lot because it's not quick. It's really prolonged. I like that point as well, Alex, because I think that we would like things to be done in the order and fashion of how we would like to control it. This is God saying, I think you need to expend some energy here. I think you need to be engaged in a new way and a new space, and He's doing this with him in a totally unexpected way. I think that's why this story is so short yet so used so often, because it's just an unexpected way of God interfering and engaging, disrupting our lives.
Which is so foreshadowing of the way that Jesus is going to interact with people, right? I mean, He's not wrestling with people, but every answer that He gives puts them in a different direction. He's always putting people back on His heels. It's never what we expect. And I also think it was a challenge, to the tenacity of Jacob. We see that in the story. Jacob finally figures out who he's wrestling, which at what point did he figure out in the middle of the night, like, this is something different? Then he just holds on for dear life, right? Yeah. Which is an interesting literary metaphor for who he is, like not letting go, right? Holding on to his brother's ankle and the whole thing. I think there's some consistency there in the writing, but right. I think that's the way God always shows up. I mean, I think this is the reason why people miss Jesus is because God showed up slant, right? Not what they expected. I think the same thing is probably true in our lives as well, that when there's a theophany, it's rarely what we think it is or what we think it's supposed to be.
Wouldn't it be great, though, if it could all be resolved in one night? I mean, I feel like problems that we have or things that are lingering in our soul often take longer than one evening, one night. But I don't know whether I'd want to wrestle all night. I don't know if I'd have the energy to wrestle all night. But I do wonder about that. How long the wrestling is, and in our lives, and what we actually have to address, and how we'd love it to speed up.
Yeah. You know what I think is interesting about this theophany and about really every theophany? When the protagonist figures out that it's God, the abject fear that they have that they're going to die because they were in the presence of God, and then the incredible gratitude of like, hey, I've seen God and I didn't die, right? You see this again and again and again in the Old Testament. What's fascinating is that the power of God is not relegated to their understanding that it's God. If God was going to kill them, His power would have shown up and they would have died immediately. When they recognize who it is, they also recognize the absolute grace that they've been given being in the presence of God. Good. Right? It's not, I just think it's funny. I was studying, what was I studying this week? I was studying Gideon this week. He does the same thing. He's like, oh, I can't believe it. I've seen God and I didn't die. It's like, well, you would have died when He showed up. You wouldn't have died when you figured it out. So it also speaks a little bit to the narcissism of like, oh, look, I just figured this whole thing out. It's like, actually, you need to recognize the grace that when God shows up.
Yeah.
in those theophanies anyway.
So, Tim, I'm curious. What you're preaching. This shows you I haven't been to the Church of Crosswalk since I'm asking this question, which I should.
How dare you?
How dare I? I'm curious about these theophanies. So they seem to come in moments of wrestling. So you see that with Jacob. You see that with Abraham. You could go down the list. Moses, certainly. They're either physical tensions or they're dramatic. Elijah, etc. I'm curious about, are we just reading these stories about these rare events in history that, boy, it's sure nice that somebody had these events, or I'm sure glad I'm not having these events, however you're going to look at it with wrestling with God. But do we need to pay more attention? I don't know what you're nudging your congregation towards, but when conflict arrives in our lives, do we need to step back and think, is this a theophany?
Yeah.
And, because usually when there's conflict, I just go, oh, I'm right, and whoever's in my way is wrong, or whatever this situation is, I will win this.
Yeah.
But do I ever stop back and say, maybe God is actually possessing the body of, the community of, whatever I'm pushing against? Is it possible that this thing I'm in tension with, that God would like to do some wrestling with me? Or do we, you see what I'm, like, or are these stories just nice, they're nice antiques in a museum and we like them and we spiritualize them towards some, overcoming eating too much chocolate or some silly application of tension in life. Does that make sense? Like, how seriously can I take these theophanies, Tim? And do I actually think they apply to me more than just a dramatic story where I try to draw some childhood, some childlike lesson from them?
Well, I think it's going to be a both and. We're preachers, and so we're gonna try and draw some conclusion. I think as I've worked on this series and gone over kind of an overwhelming amount of theophanies that we've seen. I think two things. I think one, every theophany seems to have a call. God doesn't show up for no reason. Right? So I think when you step back and say, hey, what am I wrestling with? What's this confrontation? Because they are all confrontational, quite honestly. God never shows up and goes, hey, just want to hang out, right? Even when he shows up, he's got something to do. There's a purpose for what he's doing. There's always a call. And so in that confrontation, in the midst of that confrontation, there is a call to go do, to go be, to go have. There's always that. There's also a change, right? And so that's one of the things I think we have to ask ourselves in a confrontation. How does this confrontation change me? And I think what you said is really interesting. We have a tendency not to be in confrontation unless we think we're right. Right? But confrontation is not always about right and wrong. Confrontation is about understanding and wrestling to understand more.
Yeah.
And when God shows up in the midst of a confrontation, you will not only understand more, but you also be called to do something and called to move. To me, that's the takeaway for my congregation. Two things, right? One is that there are times when you will be that Christophany, you will be that theophany for somebody else. And number two, it may be in confrontation. But that's okay.
Definitely not something to avoid. That's really good, Tim. I like that a lot. And I like the idea that we actually could be the one who actually is called to instigate.
Listen, the ones we find in the Old Testament are really dramatic, right? God is a little over the top. He shows up in a burning bush. He shows up with a sword in the middle of the road, and then doesn't show himself to Balaam. Just shows himself to Balaam's donkey. Right, that theophany is kind of fascinating. That he's trying to do something, put a wedge between this donkey and this prophet for hire, essentially. Sorry, I know we're getting away from this particular story, but maybe they're not all that dramatic.
Yeah, that's true.
And maybe that's what we're looking for, the dramatic, but that kind of underplays the nuance of God. I actually think that you don't want God to show up that dramatically in your life. Like, that's not something we should wish for. I don't want God to show up in a burning bush. Also, because I know what the call is going to be unreasonable. Because all the calls God makes is unreasonable for the person.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Right?
Yeah.
Sorry, I'm talking too much. I
No,
apologize. I'm never
that's
on
really
this thing,
good.
so.
No. You did say you preached on the passage recently, so Japhet and I said, go for it.
Lead away.
Oh, you don't have to read anymore. That's what you said.
What is the function in this story? What do we learn from the ramifications here? So there's a limp. There's ongoing pain, which, by the way, if you tie it into Genesis 33, is really interesting because he confronts Esau, and there's a feeling like this is going to be a showdown, and Jacob is basically rendered useless in any kind of sword fight or pitchfork fight, whatever they're going to have, pitchfork fight or whatever. It's interesting because what God does to Jacob is basically make it impossible for him to prevail over Esau in any kind of conflict.
Yeah.
Right.
And
Not that he would have a chance ever because he was super soft compared to his
that's
brother.
true. Yeah, that's
But yeah.
smooth skin.
Smooth skin.
Yeah. But there's a humiliation. We don't like that word. And this ties back to what you said, Tim, about, we don't really want to confront God. But there's a humiliation that's a part of the trade here. So he seeks blessing. He seeks something from God. But what God, leaves him with in return is not only blessing, but a limp.
Yeah.
And that
Because
limp,
of confrontation.
Yeah.
There's scars,
Yeah.
right? And there's scars from a wrestling with God. We carry those. We carry those scars. Hopefully, those scars for us are wisdom, right, and better understanding and compassion.
Yeah, Paul says, I would love for this scar to be taken away from me. I would love for this thorn to be.
Right.
I'd love for the limp.
Did you ever think that his bad eyesight was a direct result of the scales on his eyes?
Yes, I have wondered about that. It's interesting, isn't it?
Yeah.
I think that go ahead, Tim.
No.
I think that the fact that we actually have to linger inside the space is really good. I think that the space is created when, without our permission, and that we're pulled into these things. The difficulty is that we don't always see God in the midst of these conflicts or these moments of change and growth. And we're called to not be static. We're called to be different, and we're called to move through that. I think the fact that he has this physical reminder to everybody around him that it's not in his own strength, that he's able to be who God has called him to be, is really important. Because, in that world, and sadly in our world as well, there is a lot of stigma with disability. There's a lot of stigma with anybody who has any deformity or anything that's out of the normal of what we consider to be normal. And for him to now be the one who's broken, that's an interesting space to be inside, because we always have this image of if you're deformed or something's wrong with you, you can't come into the sanctuary. And yet here he is as a person who is actually damaged now, physically damaged, and yet he's fully, embraced by God and given a whole new name, a whole new identity, that he becomes epic by God, because it's not about what he does, but actually what God's doing through him. And that's really difficult for us to see God working through those who are broken in front of us, whether that's physical or emotional or whatever it may be. We like God to only work through perfect people.
Man, I think that is a point worth underscoring, Jay. I think that is so important, that Jacob has a disability. Again, the Apostle Paul has multiple disabilities, and yet is the principal apostle. Whatever this thorn is, a major disability, and and I think the scars of Jesus become significant after the resurrection. I think you could trace a whole. You could probably start to trace a theology. Sounds like you're turning it into a philosophy. So I was going to say theology, but a whole way of thinking and being together, where God uses and sometimes lifts up people who are, outside the standard deviation, that things have happened to them that don't make them whole, don't make us whole. And how do we see that? Well, we know how we see it. We know how we see it, we only want,
it's true.
And the church has a bad reputation sometimes. We want the pretty people up on stage. We want to highlight the culture of youth, the culture of, we could go, we could dive into that a lot. But Japhet, I think just the point you're making is really, it's worth some contemplation.
Even in our own tradition, our own tribe, in the past there was a teaching that you should move pastors along, because if the congregation should find out the pastor's not perfect, lo and behold, none of them are, then it would ruin their ability to be able to lead that congregation. And I think that has actually created this kind of like pressure point, a boiling pressure point of not reality, of us all living by the grace of God, and then deep crashing, destruction of people's own faith, because faith has been placed on the perfection of humanity, on the image of these perfect beings, and when they do not line up with your view of what's perfect, oh my goodness, it's the end of the world for everybody, and they discard God. And we've kind of created this unfortunate space where God is saying, I need you to see. I love what you pulled in, Acts, with Apostle Paul as well, and with so many others as well, that I just feel like this story is teaching us more than ever before, than I've not seen this before. The truthfully is that God works through anyone, and God works with everyone, and we should not discard those who actually don't look like us, or feel like us, or behave like us, or walk like us, because God can do powerful things through people. And I'm excited about that part of the story as well.
That's good.
So Jacob asked his wrestling partner, "What's your name?" And you notice that no answer is given.
It's more than that, though, right? It's who I am. It feels like that, right?
Yeah,
it feels
yeah.
like you know who this is.
Stop asking.
But Tim, in that though, is precisely the power of the name. I'm trying to think of a parallel, but when your children ask something, or sometimes you can just give a look like, we don't really need to have this conversation. You know who I am.
Right.
Especially not in public.
Yeah.
I'm gonna let you answer that for you.
Yeah. And I think when God does it, maybe it's God protecting his own identity, his own self. That there are places that we don't get to go. We think of this total access God, and Jesus allows us to be, but God does. There's times where God shuts the door, and that's actually not a function of sin, our own sinfulness. That's a function of, there is a difference between the creator and the creation, and this is where pantheism, or There's a departure with pantheism. There's really no difference between God and nature. By the way, this goes really to people who try to conflate kind of a naturalism, a materialism, almost an atheism, and just kind of give divine qualities to creation. In Christian theology, there is a distinction between God and everything else. And that distinction's not blurred. So while God possesses human bodies, while God's fingerprints through DNA, for example, are all over creation, there is a difference. Yes. And it will not be crossed. Creator and creation, and it will never be crossed. And I like that here. So, no, I'm not going to tell you my name, because that's one of those that we're just not going to go there.
Yeah. You can't handle the truth.
Well, look at Moses. Yeah. Moses on the mountain.
Yeah.
There's going to be a boundary.
Elijah
can't.
and
Not only
God.
can you not
Yeah.
handle it, but you're not going to go there. And it really goes back to the Garden of Eden, where there's lines. There's some things God's only going to know,
And we're not comfortable with that
No.
because we want to know everything. And we want to build that tower, and we want to reach the skies, and we want to be like God. We want to, and a lot of the stories are written with the aspirational view or the claiming of, I actually am greater than everybody else.
Well, isn't that original sin?
Yeah.
I mean, that's the
Yeah,
original
the secret.
sin, right? To be more like God.
Yeah.
When God uses the words, "Let us make man in our likeness and our image," and then more likeness is the original sin in some respects, right? Which is, I mean, that's idolatry. That's really everything. It's the power of controlling the narrative of God in some respects.
The desire for more.
And I think there's a certain respect that we lose. So, did you guys have rites of passage in your upbringing? Like, is there certain things that you had to be a certain age before your parents would let you do them? Or
Oh, I thought you were talking about, what happened at school. No.
no, I'm thinking about that. This idea that there are places you cannot go until you are a certain age or you're a certain maturity. We don't like, Japheth, I think your point is right, is spot on, which is we don't like that. We want to have total access. Kind of the death of expertise in our culture, the death of, I want to be involved in everything. I want to see everything. I want to know everything. I don't want anywhere where I don't have total access. I mean, we even pay for total access right now, right? Backstage passes to events, and like that's a mark of I can pay to be anywhere and to be anybody or with anybody.
Oh.
And there's the death of mystery with that, which I think has some real consequences.
Oh, that's good.
And I never want to be told that I don't know. I never want to be told no. I never want to be told
Be out of the loop.
Right.
Or do we have the hashtag of FOMO?
Yeah. You know what's interesting to me in this story? God wrestles with them all night. He doesn't need to do that.
Could have done it instantly.
When your kids are little, you wrestle with them, right? But you're not really wrestling with them. You're toying with them. And you're allowing them to be a part of something. At least they think they're a part of something. And we do that to kind of understand the reaction that our kids are going to have, right?
Yeah.
And so when God was done, God was like, hang on.
It's so true, Tim. I like that because God could have chosen so many other modes to bring Jacob into the space of becoming Israel, and he chose this physical one. He chose this marker. He chose this visible reality of a sign of his connection and struggle with him, and the difficulty that it takes for us to actually move from here to there requires sometimes modes and experiences that we are not choosing. Because, I mean, you think about what is he stressed about is the battle he's going to have with his brother. He's sending, when I read the story again earlier today, the reminder that how he lines up his family in the order of which ones should stay and which ones should go. And he's like,
right.
I'll keep Rachel and those ones right at the back. Let me send Leah forward. I mean, he's like calculating how the loss that he's going to have, the survival rate. He's got no inclination at all that God's going to save him right now. And so this intervention that God does inside here is incredible for what he's actually going through. It really is. It's like it's the unexpected, which I think back to your point earlier where you talked about, I don't think we all would want the burning bush. I don't think we'd all would want that. But I think that we do want the result of the burning bush in the sense of we want, to know that we are connected with God. We want to know that we're aligned with God's vision for our life. And that is actually a great space. We just don't want to have to go through the struggle or the shift.
The transformation.
The transformation. Oh,
right?
Yeah.
Which I think this story shows us that the transformation takes a while and it's hard and it's a wrestle.
Yeah.
Right? And I think the vast majority of us, and I'll include myself in this, don't hang on. right? We finally go, well, that's enough. That's probably enough. I think what this story tells us is that the tenacity of Jacob was somewhere during the night. He realized, hey, I'm not just fighting a man. I'm in the midst of some significant change. And by the way, in most of these theophanies, you have a name change. You have something pretty significant that happens.
Yes.
Because when we are transformed by God, we are no longer the same kind of human being. I mean, we have that New Testament language of being born again, right? To the point where even, we change the story of Joshua, right? We changed the name of the hill where they did all the circumcision from the hill of foreskins to like, this is where we met God, or whatever the title of that hill becomes. And so I think that there's, I think that the one of the lessons that we take from this is that transformation is tough. It's difficult. It's God led, but we have to play a part there. We have to have some tenacity to stay through that transformation.
That's true. I was just thinking about the fact that, again, ancient times, when people gave a name to their child, it was usually their prophetic way to kind of call their child into what they believed the child would become. And I've wondered about, some of the weird names that in the Bible stories that they were given, like you're the child of sorrow. And every time somebody hears your name, you're like, oh, hey, child of sorrow. You were born in difficult times. And so what you have here is God saying, it's not somebody human who's going to decide your future, your trajectory, or what your vision in life is. I'm going to be the one who's actually calling that into space. And I love that moment where he's saying, I know that you have your parents who called you this, and I know that you have identified yourself this particular way, but I'm going to give you a new identity. And this new identity is so difficult that I need you to have a mark. I need people to know that you've actually gone through something. And we don't actually share what we've gone through all the time when we have experienced these moments of transformation that have really grown us. We don't actually always express that because nobody knows that Japhet hasn't changed his name, but he's had these hip socket moments.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
Oh, that's really good.
Yeah. I see that Alex is returning, which is good as well.
Hopefully.
He's
had his time. He's had his time in the desert.
In the wilderness. Maybe he comes back with a new name.
When you think about just the practicality of the story in Genesis 32 and 33, Jacob's going home, right? And he's going home to somebody that he wronged. And the trepidation that he had, and I mean, it's clear, right? In the way he's organizing and the way he's preparing. And then he keeps calling Esau, my Lord, my Lord. Like he's overdoing it a bit. It feels like a little bit, but obviously, for someone who takes a birthright and then functions as if he's scared is pretty fascinating.
Yeah.
But that's the practicality of the situation, right? And I think it also shows us that, families can hold on to things a really long time.
Yes, they can. And I think that the intimacy of this situation is really important as well, that you have Jacob realizing that somebody who really knows him, he has a problem with. It's not a stranger. It's not like someone a colleague that you've had an argument or discussion about. It's literally that you've got somebody who actually knows your history, knows you from childhood, knows everything about you. That's who you have a problem with. That is the complex thing.
Right.
Yeah.
For sure.
Alex, good to see you.
Yeah. I've been, speaking of wrestling, I've been wrestling with a
yes.
rather unstable connectivity.
Yeah, that's weird. Aren't you home? Well, it doesn't matter. I'm in a car and it seems to be working better than you. So I don't know what kind of service you have in Walla Walla.
The superior.
Have you
The
have
superiority
you got the internet in Walla Walla?
superiority of Southern Californians. Everything is better. We'll steal everybody else's water, but other than water, we're superior.
Let's be clear. We do not steal it. We pay ridiculous amounts of money for it. So you're welcome.
Yeah.
But apparently it still is not enough that Washington would have internet.
I'm not getting any paycheck. I'm not getting any checks for that. I don't think Japheth's getting any. Colorado, he's not getting any checks.
No, we just have less greenery.
Yeah.
But it's okay.
So I don't want to jump in. I want to jump in off topic because I did lose you for.
This is a good moment to jump in.
Yeah, I guess in the last few minutes, I just think back to the incredible physicality of the story. That God is not a theory. That while God is spirit, He is. The central message of Jesus is one of flesh. Right? It's one of pain and suffering and love and physical contact and eating and drinking and being, and that God honors Jacob's body in this process. And I think that's, again, such an important feature of Christian theology and thinking, which is despite the brokenness, to your point earlier, Japhet, despite the brokenness, despite the deformity, despite the fact that we age and that the cells in our body are on a clock. Despite all of that, we see time and again in the scriptures the enfleshment of God and God interacting with our human bodies in ways that matter. And I not only like that feature of the story, I think it's critical as we think about how is it that we tend to one another's wounds. How is it that we, there's some lessons in here too, just about how we wrestle with each other. When we're in conflict with someone, do we hope that in the end we might give them a blessing? Mm-hmm. Is there, or do we wrestle that in the end we hope that we will damn them at the end of the, at the end of the process? I think the way God wrestles could provide some. So that's another lesson to me, is to think about. Because after all, Esau ends up being blessing between the brothers, right? This moment of conflict ends up in blessing. And I think, can I enter a conflict thinking, this is going to be tough and some hard things are going to get said here. This is not going to be pleasant, but I hope that we can bless each other in the end. It's almost a ridiculous idea. Like, we don't even think that way. Yeah. We think about damning each other in conflict, where this is a conflict that seeks to bless. And I just think there's something there.
We think of compromise. We think of somebody letting go in order to be able to win. I really like that point as well, Alex. I think that's really good, because to arrive in a space where you hope everybody is reunited and good is actually a really great goal of any kind of conflict.
Do you
rather
think
than
that
winning.
Do you think that God showing up diffused the confrontation between the brothers? Right? Because all of a sudden, Jacob, now Israel, has a different trajectory. He's got a different purpose. He's got a different calling. It's not just, hey, supplicate yourself in front of your brother. It's, I've already dealt with some of this, right?
Yeah.
Like, the blessing that I have is now from God. And so I can be a lot more magnanimous. I can be a lot more benevolent, through this, because the confrontation has been diffused in my heart,
Well, isn't that part of the tension of all conflicts? It's the ability to arrive at the place of the problem and not feel that you have to prove anything, and have the confidence to be able to extend more and give up of yourself in order to be able to have peace, because peace is more important than who you are. And I think he's arrived at that place where he's confident. He's not in that, he hasn't got a huge complex about, am I less than my brother? I'm just honored to be able to call you my brother.
Right.
And that's a mature place for him to be, which is great that it happened in one night. But it's actually a very difficult thing for people in conflict, because it's always feeling like there's an affront taking place, there's a diminishing happening, and you don't, and therefore I have to assert myself and put my back up, and I have to defend and whatever it may be. And he's not in that place. He's just,
Right.
man, I'm honored to see you as my big brother, and I love that. That's good.
I've been thinking about this idea for the last couple of weeks, just in my study and just reflection around that we're kind of defined by our highest hope. So that kind of defines everything. So if my highest hope is for material gain or for peace in my life today with some situation, or that the weather will be good this weekend so it doesn't mess up my plans, we're at high risk for things not going very well if we have low hopes, right? I mean, and when you live day to day that way, materialism or winning the next presidential election or whatever, that's risky. But a resurrection mindset, when you think about Jesus, to actually live into resurrection is to take your hope to a much higher level. And the effect, and I think it's played out in this story, is the effect should be that it really changes your perspective about all these other circumstances underneath it, because you have a higher hope, a higher aspiration, and then that changes all these other components of life. And I do think there's something here, you both have mentioned this too. Jacob gains peace through this higher wrestling, which then enables, no matter how it went with Esau, even if Esau had go, I'm kind of done with you, I'm going to run you through. The circumstances of that encounter really didn't matter at that point, because Jacob had entered a higher level. And I think we have such low, I'm going to name something in church politics, and I'm sorry if this offends anyone in Saltworks, but in our denomination, we've recently had a presidential election for the world church leader this week. And there's people that think it's the greatest, an election, yes. We've had people that are, thrilled. They think this leader is the best thing since, the slicing of bread itself. And then other people who think this is the worst thing ever, and all of this. And I think Tim and Japhet and I and a couple others, we talked about, or you could take the position, meh. I don't know. I got bigger things to worry about and to love and to care for, because I'm in a place, and I think we got to be careful, because if we make a really big deal out of something, that might reveal what our top interest is. And that's scary. That's scary, because that means if I'm all bummed out about some election, either in the church or in the government, if that's the thing that's driving me, that may be that's the top mountain that I've climbed. And that may reveal that I have not climbed high enough, that I have not wrestled high enough, and I'm sitting here at this level. Because once you've achieved once you've climbed to a much higher mountain, your interest in climbing lower mountains is not really there anymore. You don't have a taste for it. Right. And I think this story says, get to a higher elevation. Don't play in these lower foothill that don't really matter.
Yeah.
It's empire versus kingdom thinking, right?
Yep.
Mm-hmm.
At the end of the day, empire of man versus kingdom of God thinking.
Isn't it interesting that for Esau, this is not a conflict. This is not a tension point. You don't see that from the story that Esau's coming with anxiety and stress and staying up all night. He's just like, I'm going to see my brother Jacob and it's going to be great. Jacob thinks this is actually where I should spend all my time, my energy, and I should be wrestling and upset about all this stuff, and I don't know what I'm going to do. And maybe that's actually how we approach conflicts, and maybe that's how we put our energy into things that are taking place with church leadership, where it's like, that's not our thing. I'm not arriving at the problem because it's not my problem. That's not the thing that I'm worried about. There's actually more important things, higher hopes that we actually need to resolve.
But he needed that wrestling match, right? He needed that wrestling match to get there.
He needed that. Esau didn't need that.
Right. And sometimes we need that theophany in order to move on from the things that we're carrying, from the baggage that we're holding on to, from living those kind of empire-oriented lives. Mm-hmm. And I think, quite honestly, that has a lot to do with, like, in pastoral ministry, burnout. Because when you're really doing kingdom work, when you're really watching the kingdom expand, it's an adventure. It's exciting. When you are stuck doing empire work, it's like paying your taxes all the time. It's just exhausting. And everybody knows you got to do some of it, right? But
Yeah.
but like trying to figure out each line item is it's just too much.
Isn't it interesting? Like if you you both travel a lot. Let's say you're leaving either the smog of Southern California or inversion fog or a storm or whatever, and you get in a plane. You're like, and then you come through the clouds, and then you're above the clouds, and you're like, huh, that's just a localized event. It doesn't mean that you're dismissive. It doesn't mean you're not dismissive of that. You're not above it. You understand that there's real issues on the ground. But when you elevate above the storm, the context changes everything. And I think that that idea of empire and kingdom is very much about praying that the Spirit will take me above the storm. I see it from a new perspective, and it's not just a tempest in a teapot. I don't want to minimize or cheapen the real problems we face as human beings, because we do live in an empire, and we do have to, But the perspective when you're on that airplane and you cross 20,000, 25,000 feet, and you're above that storm, and the sun is shining, and you're like, wow, I forgot.
It's a good day.
I forgot. It's different up here, and I think that's a bit of what we're called to do. And I think maybe to go back to Crosswalk, which we talked about earlier. That's a bit of the point of going to church, right? Why do I need the regularity of every 7 days being a part of this? Mm-hmm. Hopefully, it's to reposition myself to get on an airplane and to pass 10,000 feet and to see the world differently and to try to do that with regularity.
Yeah. Perspective.
That's great.
Well, hey, about time to land this plane. Very awkward metaphorical, weird
nice transition.
Weird pastoral transition there. But good to be with you, Tim and Jay. Good to be with you, Saltworks, a family around this globe of ours. Whatever the weather is like wherever you are, in your relationships, in your community, I want to pray to be able to gain some perspective because of this little story here that's filled with such little story, right? Just a few verses, as Tim said, but filled with such power and insight into our lives and our lives with God. So let me pray for us. A little extra salt coming. Thanks for your continued support of the One Project and Saltworks. Father in heaven, for the gift of this Sabbath, we thank you for the opportunity to reflect on the scriptures, the written revelation that comes to life when we actually talk about it. Thank you. I pray that you would be with us. May we have opportunity to encounter you. May we have the courage even to wrestle with you. I thank you for these and other gifts. In Jesus' name, amen.
Amen. Amen.